Welcome to the Mindful Leadership Podcast. How do we navigate through all the noise, distractions, and pressures to make thoughtful, conscious decisions that are better for us, our people, our customers, and our organization? How do we know if we're busy and effective or just too busy to be effective? In this podcast, we talk to leaders who share their stories about challenging existing paradigms and doing different things differently. I'm your host, Shahana Banerjee, founder and CEO of Just Human, Not Resources, on a mission to humanize the future of work. In this episode, we talk to my friend and kindred spirit, Reshma Ramachandran, former Chief Transformation Officer of Adecco, a woman on a mission to help people discover their superpower and be their own greatest sponsor. Welcome, Reshma. I am so thrilled to have you on our podcast.
I'm so thrilled. For me, it is like always exciting to be on a platform where we have a common history, we have a common background. So I've been so looking forward to sitting here with you, Shahana, and sharing. I'm sure we have a lot of common stories to share.
Your energy is so infectious, Reshma. This is going to be fun. So let's dive right in. You have such an inspiring story. So tell us a little bit about your journey to get to where you are today, and also the people, the influences and experiences that have shaped you.
I grew up in a very, very rural part of India, where, whether it is the basic amenities that today I take for granted, whether it's running water, whether it's uninterrupted electric power, whether it's a public transport that runs, whether it is a system that runs, none of this was actually there. And I think for me, it has shaped me in a very subconscious way because, you never took anything for granted.
Right.
And anything that you planned and you thought that this is the way it would end, you could be 100% sure that's not the way it ends. So you kind of prepared for uncertainty. And today, when you talk to leaders, everyone talks about COVID, right? Pandemic, which nobody expected, how it has disrupted the world. And I think I truly, truly believe that Indian leaders have done better simply because we grew up like that. We didn't have certainty over anything. You were just prepared for the unprepared. And for me, this has really been my growing up years. And in terms of influence, back then, there wasn't too many role models to say that this is how I would like to be. But people who have greatly influenced me during my growing up years were definitely the women in my family, my mom included, who all had jobs. Back then, when there was no flexible working, when maternity leaves were very, very limited, when there was no formal childcare, all of the women in my family have held the jobs. And they actually showed it to me that it is possible.
Yeah.
It is really possible.
Yeah, that's amazing.
All the women have been extremely strong, not bowed down to the social norm.
Yeah, that is actually so interesting because there are strong women in our lives and, we can choose to actually have them as role models, which in the moment it may not appear so, but they influence us in so many ways. And then you went on to pursue a career in STEM. So tell us a little bit about that.
My first love was English literature. I'm still a very ardent reader. Like I read just about everything. And, I have a huge interest in English literature. And, if times were different, probably I would have pursued a degree in English literature. But back then, this would have definitely not given me the financial independence. And I was really good at math. So there was also the social expectation that, if you're good at math, go pursue engineering. So pursued engineering, joined one of the largest Indian conglomerates, Larsen & Toubro, joined as a management trainee. And I have to say the first 7 years that I spent with L&T has been really formative, really foundational, where, I got to do a lot of things. I was probably one of the first women who joined and was put into the operational side. Even today, I think, when you think about certain careers, women are not put on the field. Women are actually put on desk jobs. So L&T was no different back then, but we were the first batch of women where we had the opportunity to be on the front line, the field. So I was also the first woman to have gone to site in Middle East, where my shock, there was no ladies' toilets because, women didn't show up at the construction site. It was designed for men. And just to go to the ladies' toilet, I had to travel 9 kilometers, go to a gas station. Definitely was an interesting 7 years for me. Today, again, you read a lot of things where the system is not designed for women, but where I have actually felt all of that and experienced all of that firsthand, and how we actually exclude women, probably unintentionally.
Yes.
But
I'm smiling because it sounds so familiar to me as well.
Shana, you and I, we should definitely talk about also is like, many a times, I'm sure both of us have been the first, the only, or the few. And, how that has actually shaped us as people. There were a lot of things that was like very new for the organization as well. But what was really encouraging was that many of the men who were in positions of power and who had the power to change and who had to change the system, they actually took that step forward and said, we want to make a change. So I had very positive experience in my early days where no one said, oh, the easy thing is to remove her from the system. That was not the attitude. The attitude was that let's fix the system. So I have to say those 7 years were really formative, foundational, and gave me a lot of encouragement that if I'm vocal about things, there are people who would actually listen to it and take action.
Yeah. Being a civil engineer, starting your career as a civil engineer, being on a construction site, doing project management, especially in some of the Middle East countries that you're talking about, must have been hard. So could you share maybe a situation that you were in where, you might have been the only, and how did you actually go about being successful in that role?
I've been the only woman in the room, young, unmarried woman, both in an Indian context and in a Middle Eastern context. People have always looked at me with caution. Oh, who is she? What is she really bringing to the table? Why is she even here? I have stayed in a campsite, so construction campsites, where there has been only men. So these are all experiences that are very fresh in my mind and where I have probably questioned myself, why didn't I take a desk job?
Yeah.
Because the desk job would have been so much easier in that sense. Now, again, 22 years hence, I feel what fuels me, what powers me is also doing the impossible, being a pioneer in that sense. And I would say what really, really fuels me is also rejections. When people say no, and when people say, no, you can't do it, or a woman can't do it, or my tribe can't do it, I think I take it as a challenge and I say, no, I'm going to actually come back and show you how we can do it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So could you tell us a story where you did get told that, no, maybe you shouldn't be doing this, but you did it anyway?
By education, I'm a civil engineer. I started my career as a construction site engineer, a civil design engineer. And then, if you really see where I am today, I'm at the C-suite. I don't do anything that is civil engineering anymore. So if you would ask me what's my role, it's really the chief digital officer. So it's completely different. And when I wanted to make a switch from civil engineering or hardcore construction to my next step was management consulting, which gave me kind of a steep learning curve. And then I moved into a large-scale manufacturing of equipment, project management, manufacturing management. So a complete shift, right? And then I wanted to move into digital because this was, if you see about 5 to 7 years back, digital was really the buzzword. And I said, I want to move into the digital space. People in positions of power told me, how can a civil engineer with a background of civil engineering or construction engineering to manufacturing at the best, how can she even think of being in the digital space? And I still remember one of the business unit heads where there was a position open and I wanted the job, the head of digital. And I went and spoke to him and he said, he looked at me, he really looked at me in a way that, are you serious? Do you really think you can do it? And he told me in a very polished way, he said, we need someone with digital experience. And back then I argued with him saying, every time there is a new skill that is coming to the market, you're not going to get people with their experience. And I can learn, I'm a fast learner, I can learn and I can deliver. And he was very adamant and said, we want someone with a digital experience. Why I say this as an example is, many times what also happens to a lot of people is when someone like that, imagine a business unit president telling you that, you would actually go back and sit in your chair and in your seat and think, okay, this is where I belong. I'm not going to
Right.
pursue it. And for me, I took that as a challenge and said, you know what, I'm going to show you that I can do it. And a lot of it was really my own interest in learning and then doing within the job that I had to say I could do. And it took me about 3 years to actually make the shift, but I could make the shift to the whole digital space.
Yeah. And did you shift within the same organization or did you leave?
I shifted. Fortunately, I shifted within the same organization. But this is also, and if you really look at my career path, I have worked with 5 different organizations. I think organizations are a platform. Each of us as individuals, we have a purpose. If our purpose aligns with the purpose of the platform, you have a good match. If that doesn't align, move on, because neither the organization gains nor do you gain. So it's important that there is a match. And for me, I've always looked at organizations as a platform where I can bring my ideas to life. And if organizations don't serve that purpose, either look for other organizations. So in this case, no, I did not leave the organization.
Yeah.
But many times I have left simply because I don't want an organization to curtail my learning ambition.
Yeah, very well said, Reshma. Very well said. So I'm curious, the person they finally hired for that digital role originally, did they actually have digital experience?
Well, yes and no. And, this is privilege sometimes works, right? So the person that they hired did have certificate course on something in digital. So yes, if you put that as an experience, probably yes.
Interesting. So let's get into leadership. Most of us end up just falling into leadership. We rarely have the opportunity, the space, or the support actually to reflect as to who we want to be as a leader and what is the impact we want to have on our team, on our stakeholders, on others. Talk a little bit maybe about how you defined who you want to be as a leader and how did you discover that? What was that journey like for you?
Every time I'm asked this question, I always say there is a clear distinction between the thoughts and action. So everyone wants to be a good leader. I've not met a single person who has said, I want to be a bad leader. Everyone wants to be a good leader. So the intent and the action, there is a gap. And that is why we have good leaders and poor leaders, right? So for me, I started off thinking I want to be a good leader. And what's the definition of a good leader? Empathetic, humble, encouraging the team to grow. So this is really how I started out. I got a team when I was 25, 26, when I went to this Middle Eastern side. And, most of them twice my age. I studied in one of the premier institutes in India. So you go there and you think you know it all. And you stand there and think, I tell and people do. And you're humbled because
that's not how it works.
Yeah, someone who is really good at math, who has done engineering, what do you think? She shows up as logical, analytical, reasoning, critical thinking, all those things. You stand up there in this middle of this desert, which is like 55 degrees, and you tell people to do things and nobody wants to do it. And it was truly humbling for me. And that's also when I realized that the thought that I'm a good leader does not always necessarily convert to action. So this is also where I started on the whole self-reflection journey. And I think I still have blind spots. I think for me, it's so important that we self-reflect at the end of the day and we are self-aware. So my team, they're very, very confident. Sometimes I'm taken aback when I get a feedback. Saying, really, they have a high psychological safety to come and tell me things or call out things. And I always say, one-on-one is good, but you also have the freedom and the liberty to call out in meetings, because what happens is if you always take one-on-one, others don't get to see that somebody has called out and how I respond. And again, this is so important, right?
Yeah, true. It's also interesting because you have actually been a leader now who's lived in 13 different countries, right? And so leading people of different ethnicities, having such a large, diverse global team as you have had, Obviously, that also is a huge leadership accelerator. I think it helps us understand much more about our leadership style and how we can adapt our style and use different aspects of leadership to be able to be effective in different contexts, right? So could you perhaps think of an example or a story where you might have faced a challenge, or you might have faced maybe people giving feedback differently than you're used to, and how did that help you grow?
Having lived in 13 countries, but then worked with, I would say, probably over 100 different nationalities, there is a difference in the national culture. Some of the cultures are very direct, so you can actually give a direct feedback and take a
Right.
direct. Some of the cultures are not so direct. So for me, it's also adapting to the national cultures. So some of the people in the team are actually very vocal because they're psychologically safe on their own. But when you think about certain other people on the team, especially ethnic minorities, they're not psychologically safe. They can't actually speak up. So you have to actually encourage them to speak. So one of the rules that I have in my team is also anybody can talk anything in meetings, but at least at the end, we do a round robin, which means everyone gets to say something. As leaders, it is our responsibility to make sure that people with different backgrounds feel that psychological safety to actually one, show up as themselves, but also adjust our own behaviors to make sure that they feel safe at work. I have worked, I've spent some time in Sweden. Every time I would travel from Zurich to Sweden, and we would discuss ideas. So it's a consensus-based system where we would discuss ideas and people would say yes. I would leave and thinking, this would be done.
Right.
And you go back next week and you realize that we are starting over the discussion again. This was really frustrating for me because every time you go, you are actually going back to square one. And at some point, I think it was 4 weeks after, I had to really sit down with one of my teammates and really ask what's going on. And then he explained to me how the whole consensus works. How do you actually make things stick is through something called fika. So fika is coffee and cake. So it's a very informal setting, and you actually sit in a coffee corner and you discuss and debate ideas, which means there is no hierarchy. It's a very informal setting. So
Right,
people can
right.
actually speak their mind, and they are actually talking about why things won't work. They'll actually talk about their frustration, but everyone speaks, and it's over coffee and cake.
Yeah.
And once that fika is done, people are actually taking bits and pieces of what they can do. And it took me 4 weeks to realize, in formal settings, things don't work. But the moment you make it very informal, where there is no hierarchy, where there is no fear of repercussion, where it's just over coffee and cake, things actually work. And there are influences as well, right? So it's not the
Yeah.
positional hierarchy, there are influences. So this was a
Yeah.
huge learning for me.
So coffee and cake is the key to psychological safety. That's the moral of the story.
There you go. Yes, exactly.
Oh, that's a good one. But that's such a great story, right? Because being effective in different cultures is truly about understanding, right, how things work and how you can really adapt your leadership style in order to help people in that particular environment thrive. So beautifully done. And, it's such a great story as well. Talking of leadership and leading in, so many countries, because, you made this point about feedback, right? So can you think of maybe an example of receiving feedback in a very different context from yours? Did that help you grow as a leader?
So I can share several stories. I
Yeah.
solicit feedback. So I grew up in a society where feedback was something that was very negative. If you
Right.
receive a feedback, it was an equivalent to criticism. So the feedback was always a criticism. So you don't necessarily get positive feedback. It was a lot of unlearning for me to say, no, feedback is good. The only time I don't take feedback is, when feedback is given to put me down. I'll give you a recent example where one of the feedback that I received from my boss was, I'm a very poor communicator. So I don't know if it is because he couldn't understand my accent, or if it is that he was just putting me down because he didn't like me speaking, my whole style of speaking. So this is a constant feedback that I was receiving from him, saying my communication is not good. And I kept telling him, unless it is specific, you need to tell me what part of my communication is not good. Unless it is specific, I can't take it as a feedback. And, he kept coming back and saying my communication is not good. And that's at some point I stopped it and said, I'm not taking it. So that's the only time I don't take feedback, where I know he was trying to put me down. Because if you're not putting me down, feedback should always come up with a follow-up where you actually tell the person how to correct it, right?
Right. Well, I must say that the point you just made is so interesting, because often we know that minorities specifically get very non-specific feedback, right? So if it's positive, you get told, just keep doing what you're doing and things will happen for you, which is like, what does that mean? Or you get told things like fix your communication skills or executive presence, which I honestly hate. And it's so non-specific that you can't possibly do anything about it because you don't know what's broken. Is it your accent? Is it your style of communication? Is it oral? Is it verbal? Is it, written? What is it? Is it about presenting to a group of people? Is it presenting at an executive forum? What is the specific issue? Right, is never communicated. And so it's so interesting that you say that, because it's the experience of so many that unless you get specific feedback, how could you possibly do anything about it and grow?
Yeah, and in my whole pursuit of fitting in, I have taken a lot of these absurd feedback and, beaten myself up. And that's something that I stopped about 5-6 years back. And I said, unless it is something that is said with an intent and help for me to improve, I am not taking it. When I come into a workplace as a minority, and you are actually telling me, your communication is bad, unless you're specific, or, I've got the feedback saying, you need to tone down your energy. And I'm like, what specifically does that mean? This is who I am. I can't.
What could that possibly mean?
Yes. And, if you actually say that I should talk less, so probably some of the meetings I might be actually talking more. If your feedback is specific and you tell me that, oh, you have so much of energy and you're talking more, this is specific. But if you just tell me tone down your energy, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Yeah.
Same as communication, simply because we think you don't have executive presence, none of which is tangible.
Yeah. And I think it's neither constructive nor developmental, because let's say that you are talking too much in a meeting. I think the way of giving constructive feedback would be to say, what did you think of the meeting, right? Were you able to hear the points of view of everyone else in the meeting? And then you might say, oh, maybe I talked too much in the meeting. So it's about your leader being able to bring about that self-reflection for you, to be able to say, oh, the way that I might be able to help in a meeting, if I have psychological safety, is to help others voice their opinions and maybe hang back a little bit and then express mine. And so that's a better way to give feedback than to say, tone down your energy, because who knows what that even means.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, Shana, coming back to your question on, receiving feedback. So one of the feedback that I have to say I took very deeply, and I have gone through a lot of self-reflection on that, was when one of my biases were pointed out. So, one of the projects that we were working on, we needed to have, it was basically product development. So, you need to have technical expertise in that sense. One of the biases that I had was towards age. So there was a gentleman on the team who was older, and there was another gentleman on the team who was younger. And, when it comes to digital skills, my unconscious bias was a younger person is actually more ready to learn and more receptive to learning compared to an older person. So that was one of the biases. And the second one was, the engineer versus non-engineer, engineer by degree versus non-engineer.
Right.
And when I was actually, this was one of the critical projects, high visibility, high criticality in that sense. When we were putting the team together, there were discussions. Typically, my team meetings are very open. There are discussions, and we put the team, and I generally sometimes I speak in terms of veto. We put the team together. After the discussions and the team was put together, the older gentleman, and one of them who was not an engineer, came to me and said, we want to give you a feedback and address one of our concerns. And it was exactly about the age and my bias towards engineers. And
Right.
I think this was a very reflective moment for me. My mind was thinking, if you're an engineer, you're technically better. It's not true.
Right.
Actually, digital skills, if you really see, it's got nothing to do with an engineering degree. And the same thing, just because you are older doesn't mean that you don't have the aptitude to learn. So both of which I wholeheartedly took. We rejigged the team. So, both of them were eventually part of the team. But this was a huge self-reflective moment for me, where, as an advocate for implicit bias, I feel like I'm
Right.
so self-reflective and aware of my biases, and I still have blind spots.
Yeah. But I think the lesson there is that, it's not that we won't make mistakes, but it's that when we realize we have made a mistake, we can own up to it, right? And make it better. So what was the outcome of actually including those two individuals on your project team?
You are right. And I think this is where leadership is tough, right? Sometimes owning it up publicly actually means swallowing your pride and ego. So I did own up publicly, swallowing my pride and ego. And I think it earned me some credibility and respect for sure.
Right.
I also think it was good to have these two people in the team because they definitely contribute.
Right.
And it was also a lesson learned for everyone in the team.
What an important lesson as well, because we talk so often about diversity, but we don't necessarily show the value that diversity brings on an everyday basis. You know what I mean? So in this particular case, not only did you own up to, the mistake, but including them on the team showed the entire team and potentially the organization, because it was such a high value project, the true value that it can bring when you have a very diverse set of people on the project team. So this was a great example of that. We can go on forever, but in the spirit of sort of bringing this to a close, I thought I'd put together some rapid fire questions for you. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So you've lived in 13 countries across 3 continents. How many languages do you speak?
7.
Wow. How many languages can you order coffee and cake in?
7.
That's wonderful. If you were a superhero, what would be your superpower?
My superpower would be actually helping people get over their self-limiting beliefs. So really bringing the superhero in others.
Wow, that's amazing. Really good one, Reshma. If your life were made into a movie, I hope Bollywood's listening. What would the theme song be?
Oh, this is a tough one. I'm not at all into music. So there's a Hindi song that comes to my mind. Hum honge kamyab.
Ah, We Shall Overcome, for those of you who don't know Hum
Exactly.
Honge Kamyab. But that's the song. Oh, well said. Well said, Reshma. Last one. So what is one piece of advice that has really helped you in your career? And what is one piece of advice that you would share with our listeners today?
One piece of advice that has really helped me in my career came from one of my first bosses, and who continues to be a mentor, was to accept things that we cannot change, to change things that we can, and to give us the serenity to know the difference. And I'm not there yet. And I think this is the whole emotional intelligence part. I'm work in progress in terms of that. But to having the wisdom or the serenity to understand when do we need to control, when do we need to let go? That's actually the whole emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
What I want to leave all of you with is you need to open doors for yourself. As minorities, we have a lot of mentors. We don't have sponsors. So we don't have people who speak our names in the rooms. And I do not have sponsors. I have a lot of people who give me advice and who give me suggestions and who mentor me, who's happy to coach me, but I do not have sponsors. I'm my own sponsor. And I actually believe in opening doors for myself. And so what I want to leave all the viewers with is that you don't wait for somebody else to come and save you. Don't wait for someone else to come and overcome things for you. Don't wait for someone else to come and open doors for you. You are enough. You're good enough. go do things yourself and start believing in yourself more.
Be your own sponsor. What a great note to end the podcast on. This has been so much fun, Reshma. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your wisdom with our listeners.
And thanks so much, Shana. I know this has been long pending, and I have to say this was worth the wait.
Absolutely.